What happens when a Roman general decides that fear is more useful than victory, and cruelty more effective than discipline? That question echoes through the darkest corners of Roman history, where power was not just exercised, but displayed, staged, performed, like a ritual meant to crush the mind before it ever touched the body. The 5 most inhumane displays of power by Roman generals were not accidents of rage. They were deliberate constructions of terror, engineered to send messages that outlived the men who committed them. When you explore these episodes, you start to see a pattern. Rome did not simply conquer its enemies, it broke them from the inside out. Imagine a world where generals were not merely commanders, but architects of psychological domination. Roman legions already moved like machines, but certain commanders pushed the boundaries far beyond military necessity. They understood something chilling. A single act of public brutality could accomplish what months of siege could not. The Roman Empire celebrated discipline, order, and calculated force, yet behind those ideals lurked men who turned cruelty into strategy. Some of these generals believed fear was the purest form of control. Others believed humiliation could dissolve loyalty more effectively than any blade. And a few crossed a threshold that even fellow Romans whispered about in disgust. What made these displays so inhumane was not only the violence itself, but the intention behind it. These acts were not committed in the heat of battle. They were staged with precision, crafted to be seen, remembered, feared. They targeted soldiers who faltered, civilians who resisted, entire communities who dared question Roman authority. And every time, the message was the same. Resistance is not just futile, it is unforgivable. But beneath the surface of cruelty lies something even more disturbing. These displays were also performances for Rome itself. Generals competed for reputation, for political advantage, for the kind of ruthless fame that kept rivals silent and the Senate compliant. The brutality became a language, one understood by enemies and allies alike. And once a general realized that terror elevated his name, the line between strategy and sadism dissolved into dust. As you dive deeper into these episodes, you may notice something unsettling. These acts reveal less about strength and more about fear. Fear within the commanders themselves, fear of losing control, fear of appearing weak, fear that authority might crumble if not reinforced with blood. And when fear governs a man with absolute power, humanity becomes collateral damage. The question is not whether Rome went too far. The real question is how far a general was willing to go when no one had the power to stop him. Some of the things you will discover challenge the glorified image of Roman discipline and reveal a much darker reality at the heart of its expansion. You already sense where this is heading, and what you will uncover might surprise you. Before we continue, tell me in the comments what you think drives a leader to commit acts that even their own civilization struggled to justify, and make sure to like the video and check if you're already subscribed, since understanding this content is essential to grasp how power truly operated in the ancient world. And as we move forward, the layers only get darker as we step into the next part, where the true machinery of fear begins to unfold. When the Roman army marched under a general who believed terror was a form of discipline, every soldier understood that the true battlefield began long before any enemy appeared. The legions were admired for their structure, their order, their relentless efficiency. But inside that machine lived a darker truth. Some commanders transformed military punishment into a spectacle so extreme that even Rome's rigid system seemed fragile beside it. To these generals, cruelty was not an impulsive outburst, but a carefully measured instrument that kept tens of thousands of men obedient, not through loyalty, but through dread. You have to imagine the atmosphere inside a Roman camp when a general known for brutality inspected the ranks. The silence was heavy, almost suffocating, because soldiers understood that discipline in such an army did not mean simple reprimands. It meant demonstrations designed to burn themselves into memory. A single wavering formation, a dropped shield, a soldier showing exhaustion at the wrong moment, these could become triggers for a display meant to remind the entire legion that weakness carried a cost no one was willing to pay twice. What made these punishments so terrifying was not only the suffering inflicted, but the knowledge that they were intentionally public. Every man present was forced to witness, to absorb, to understand that failure was not an error, but an offense against the general himself. Some commanders resurrected, punishments so ancient and severe that they had almost disappeared from Roman practice. Others invented new forms of humiliation tailored to strip away identity, dignity, and the soldier's sense of belonging to the legion. A few even orchestrated collective penalties, methods where an entire group paid for the failings of one. There were nights when soldiers lay awake in their tents, not fearing the enemy across the battlefield, but the man who led them. Because in these armies, the greatest threat did not come from foreign lands. It marched beside them, commanded them, judged them, and could end them with a gesture. And yet, paradoxically, this terror often produced armies that appeared unnervingly disciplined. Fear created an order so rigid that legions could execute maneuvers with mechanical precision, moving as if controlled by a single mind. From the outside, these units looked unstoppable, embodiments of Roman power and efficiency. But inside, beneath the polished armor and synchronized steps, morale corroded quietly. Men who marched under such commanders rarely felt pride, they felt survival. Loyalty became something hollow, a fragile shell masking the instinct to obey because disobedience meant suffering that lingered longer than death. What makes this dynamic even more unsettling is the way these generals believed they were serving Rome. In their minds, cruelty was a necessary counterweight to chaos. They saw fear as the only force capable of shaping ordinary men into instruments of empire. And for a time, Rome accepted this logic because the results were undeniable. Victories on foreign soil, crushed rebellions, territories subdued with frightening efficiency. But underneath those triumphs lived a darker foundation, one built not on unity or honor, but on the calculated destruction of the soldier's spirit. And as these generals continued to refine their methods, something shifted. Punishment evolved into performance, discipline into domination. You can almost feel how the weight of these choices began shaping not just individual soldiers, but the culture of entire legions, molding them into reflections of their commanders' values. This growing cycle of fear and obedience would soon collide with even more dramatic displays of power, where punishment no longer targeted individuals alone, but entire populations caught in the path of a general determined to prove that Rome's authority was absolute and that resistance, in any form, carried consequences far beyond the battlefield. As Roman generals pushed their power beyond the boundaries of discipline and into the realm of psychological domination, their methods began reaching far beyond the soldiers who served them. The brutality once reserved for internal control spilled outward into the territories they marched through, reshaping entire populations with fear as deliberate policy. Conquered people already lived under the shadow of Roman authority. But when certain commanders arrived, the atmosphere shifted from occupation to something far more suffocating. These generals understood that to break a community, you did not need to destroy its walls. You needed to destroy its sense of identity. Humiliation became a strategic tool. Some generals forced entire towns to witness the punishment of a single rebel, turning a simple execution into a ritual crafted to crush hope. Others degraded local leaders publicly, stripping them of clothing, status, and dignity before their own people, ensuring that no figure remained who could inspire resistance. There were commanders who orchestrated ceremonies designed to remind civilians that Rome controlled not only their laws, but their very existence. Every scream, every display of suffering, every carefully staged act of cruelty carried a message. Roman power was not simply a political force, it was a psychological cage. What made these tactics especially devastating was their precision. General after general learned to manipulate the emotional core of a conquered population. They targeted symbols first, sacred objects, ancestral rituals, community leaders. Anything representing continuity or hope became immediate targets. If a village revered a certain tree, it was cut down. If a community honored an ancestral shrine, it was defiled. If a region respected a priest or elder, that person was made an example. The brutality was not random. It was tailored to the spirit of the people being subdued, engineered, to make them question not just their safety, but their very identity. Entire regions learned that resistance meant more than death. It meant watching the things that defined them be erased, mocked, or repurposed as displays of Roman victory. Some generals marched prisoners through their own villages before executing them in central squares, forcing families to confront their powerlessness. Others forced populations to participate in their own humiliation, compelling them to applaud. Punishment of their neighbors or carry out tasks meant to break any sense of unity. When a general wielded psychological terror, this effectively, the battlefield ceased to be a physical space. It shifted into the minds of the people, carving wounds deeper than any sword. And yet the Romans believed these measures kept the empire stable. By crushing identity, they believed they prevented rebellion. Meanwhile, the affected populations learned to live with the constant tension of survival, knowing that any misstep could trigger another display of Roman cruelty. Generals who mastered this psychological warfare gained reputations that spread far faster than their armies ever could. Entire provinces surrendered at the mere rumor of their approach, choosing submission over the horrors their methods had produced elsewhere. Fear became an advanced weapon, clearing paths for Roman dominance without a single arrow fired. But the danger of such power was that once a general realized how easily he could shape the emotions of thousands, the boundary between enforcing order and indulging cruelty began to dissolve. The targeted humiliation of conquered people was only the beginning. As these commanders grew more confident, they sought new ways to demonstrate that their authority extended far beyond physical conquest. And soon, their displays of power would escalate into acts so extreme that even Rome itself struggled to understand how far one man could go to prove that resistance, in any form, was something he intended to erase entirely. As the pattern of psychological domination deepened, some Roman generals discovered that terror alone was not enough. They needed to craft messages so unmistakable that entire regions would carry the memory for generations. These were no longer simple acts of punishment or tools of discipline. They were demonstrations calibrated to reshape reality itself, to make anyone who witnessed them feel that resistance was not only dangerous, but fundamentally pointless. The generals behind these displays did not see themselves as mere military leaders. They saw themselves as the embodiment of Roman authority, and in their pursuit of absolute control, they turned cruelty into a language more powerful than any decree issued in the Senate. One of the most disturbing trends among these commanders was the deliberate use of theatricality. They understood that a message delivered through extreme brutality embedded itself deeper than any order conveyed through words. Civilians and soldiers alike were forced to watch as these men performed violence with a precision that bordered on ritual. Some generals paraded mutilated prisoners through the streets, not simply to degrade them, but to create a collective memory that would pass from parent to child. Others staged mass punishments at dawn, choosing the early light not for convenience but for symbolism, allowing the rising sun to reveal the consequences of defiance in harsh detail. There were moments when entire communities felt the air itself change as these events unfolded. Markets fell silent. Children were pulled indoors. Elders whispered warnings that everyone already knew but needed to hear again. The general's message reached every doorway. Rome does not negotiate with defiance, and neither do I. These demonstrations shaped the emotional climate of whole provinces, making the mere sight of Roman standards enough to trigger fear long before an army marched into view. Through carefully orchestrated cruelty, these generals created a psychological empire layered atop the physical one, a structure built not with stone, but with dread. As their tactics escalated, so did their ambition. Some sought to impress political rivals in Rome by proving they could pacify regions faster and more definitively than any predecessor. Others used brutality to silence potential challenges within their own ranks, sending a stark warning to tribunes, centurions, and even fellow commanders: challenge my authority, and you will face consequences no one will forget. Power in Rome was always precarious, and these displays of inhumanity were as much about securing personal legacy as they were about enforcing imperial rule. In this environment, cruelty became currency, traded for influence, reputation, and political survival. What makes these acts even more chilling is how calculated they were. The generals responsible did not act in rage or haste. They acted with deliberation. They chose the victims, the setting, the audience. They crafted the message. They ensured the memory endured. And as the empire expanded, these demonstrations became darker, shaped by the growing belief that the more extreme the display, the more complete the control. It was no longer enough to suppress rebellion. They needed to erase the very idea that rebellion was possible. But beneath the surface, something was shifting in the empire itself. Whispers reached Rome, rumors of generals whose actions blurred the line between authority and madness. Reports of entire communities broken beyond repair raised questions about whether such brutality strengthened Rome or quietly sowed the seeds of future unrest. Yet those concerns did little to restrain the commanders who believed their power was proof of divine favor. With every new display, they pressed further, reaching levels of cruelty that reshaped not only the lands they conquered, but the very identity of Roman dominance. And from here their actions would evolve into something even more dangerous, as the pursuit of absolute control pushed them into territories where violence became not just a tool, but a testament to their own unchallenged authority. Before we continue deeper into this, tell me in the comments what you think drives a leader to turn punishment into performance, and how these displays might have shaped the spirit of entire civilizations. As these displays of cruelty spread across the empire, a more disturbing truth began to reveal itself. For some Roman generals, violence ceased to be a means and became an obsession. What started as punishment or political messaging evolved into acts so extreme that even hardened legionaries felt an unease they could not voice aloud. These were moments when cruelty abandoned any pretense of strategy. The line between enforcing order and indulging in brutality dissolved entirely, and the generals responsible seemed almost fueled by the very terror they created. Their actions were not dictated by necessity, but by a hunger to demonstrate power in ways no one could ignore. Soldiers who once accepted severe discipline as part of Roman life found themselves witnessing scenes that left them silent long after the spectacle was over. Some generals ordered executions that dragged through entire days, stretching out suffering as if the duration itself were part of the message. Others carried out punishments on a scale meant to overwhelm the senses, Rows of prisoners sacrificed not for defiance, but for symbolism, arranged in patterns that would be remembered by any who survived to tell the story. To the men who followed these commanders, the battlefield suddenly felt less dangerous than the camp behind them. Even civilians who had grown accustomed to Roman authority felt the difference when these generals arrived. Their cruelty had an intensity that went beyond controlling populations or asserting dominance. It felt personal, as though each demonstration was a challenge to the world itself. Question me, and I will show you how far I can go. Communities that had once hoped negotiation might soften Roman rule discovered that with certain commanders, no agreement could protect them. These were the generals who saw mercy as weakness and restraint as failure. They believed that fear must be renewed constantly, fed like a fire that consumed anything in its path. Whispers circulated among the legions. Some soldiers argued that such displays damaged Rome's honor, yet none dared voice the truth to their commanders. Others insisted that these acts were necessary to crush resistance quickly and prevent future bloodshed. But beneath every argument lay the same growing certainty. There were generals whose power had expanded beyond the empire's ability to control them. Their reputations spread faster than their troops, and entire regions surrendered preemptively, just to avoid being chosen as the stage for the next atrocity. When fear reached that scale, the general no longer needed to raise his voice. His name alone did the work. Yet the danger of such unchecked authority was not only the suffering it inflicted on civilians. It also reshaped the legions themselves. Soldiers learned to mirror the ruthlessness of their commanders, believing brutality was the path to survival, respect, or promotion. Young recruits entering the army encountered rituals that blended violence with ceremony, acts designed to harden them quickly, stripping them of hesitation or compassion. Over time, this created forces that no longer distinguished between necessary force and theatrical cruelty. They became extensions of their commander's will, reflections of the harsh values he imposed on them. The empire, vast and powerful, often failed to see the transformation happening within its own ranks. Rome celebrated victories, expanded territories, and praised the generals who accomplished these feats with terrifying efficiency. But beneath that success lay a shadow growing thicker with every campaign. A handful of commanders were crafting their own versions of Rome, shaped not by law or order, but by dominance expressed through escalating brutality. And as those patterns spread, they began influencing not just conquered territories, but the internal dynamics of the empire itself, setting the stage for consequences that reached far beyond the battlefield and into the heart of Roman identity. As the actions of these generals grew more extreme, the shockwaves began to echo back toward Rome itself. Reports of entire communities shattered by orchestrated cruelty forced senators, magistrates, and political rivals to confront a reality they were never prepared to manage. The Roman Republic had long believed it could control its commanders through tradition, oversight, and the constant fear of political repercussions. But as the empire expanded, distance became a shield. Generals operated far from the capital, and in that distance, their power swelled to a scale that unsettled even the most hardened Roman officials. In the Senate, debates sparked behind closed doors. Some insisted that these generals achieved results unmatched by any of their predecessors, pacifying rebellious territories in record time and returning immense spoils to the treasury. Their brutality, they argued, was simply a tool of imperial efficiency. Others warned that such unrestrained cruelty threatened to distort the very nature of Roman rule. Rome prided itself on laws, on civilization, on the belief that order flowed from discipline rather than unhinged terror. But when word spread of atrocities that surpassed military necessity, certain senators began to question whether the empire was becoming dependent on men who no longer served it, but acted in their own expanding shadows. Among the people of Rome, reactions were equally divided. Victories were celebrated with festivals, statues, triumphs, and public feasts funded by the riches brought home. Citizens who benefited from the expansion saw these generals as heroes, embodiments of the unstoppable Roman spirit, but stories slipped through the cracks. Traders, travelers, and soldiers returning from distant provinces whispered accounts of entire villages erased, soldiers punished with methods that defied tradition, and conquered populations left so traumatized that they could no longer function. These whispers planted seeds of unease that slowly took root in the Roman mind. The legions themselves added to this tension. Soldiers who served under such commanders often returned to Rome, changed in ways that their families and fellow citizens struggled to understand. The violence they had witnessed, and in many cases participated in, left marks not visible on the skin, but engraved deeper. Some veterans became detached, unable to reintegrate into daily life after marching behind a general who taught them that cruelty was normal and hesitation was deadly. Others carried a quiet admiration for their leaders, believing that Rome's dominance depended on the willingness to do what others feared. This duality created a silent divide within the military body that Rome relied upon so heavily. And then there were the political rivals, other ambitious generals, senators, and influential families who saw opportunity in the chaos. They questioned whether these commanders had grown too powerful, too independent, too willing to act without oversight. Yet confronting them directly risked backlash from soldiers loyal to their leaders and citizens dazzled by their victories. Rome found itself facing a paradox. The men who secured its borders were the same men who threatened its stability. Their cruelty, once dismissed as distant rumors, became a political burden Rome could not easily ignore. What made the situation even more volatile was the realization that these generals were not isolated anomalies. Their methods, once shocking, began influencing others who sought similar dominance. What began as individual displays of brutality evolved into a cultural undercurrent within certain factions of the Roman military. Each general who rose to power through terror set a precedent that emboldened others, gradually shifting the balance of how authority was expressed across the empire. And all the while, Rome watched with a mixture of pride and dread, sensing that the very forces expanding its borders were beginning to strain the foundations of its identity. As the empire continued to grow, the repercussions of these violent displays would not remain confined to distant provinces. They would begin shaping the future of Rome itself in ways no one was prepared to confront. As Rome struggled to reconcile the glory of expansion with the darkness spreading through its armies, the brutality of certain generals reached an even more intricate level. No longer satisfied with crushing resistance or staging theatrical punishments, these commanders began targeting the emotional core of entire societies. Their goal was not only to enforce submission, but to break the beliefs, traditions, and spiritual anchors that held these communities together. It was psychological devastation on a scale the ancient world had rarely witnessed, engineered with precision and carried out with chilling intention. In many conquered regions, identity was woven through rituals, ancestral customs, and sacred narratives that had survived centuries of change. Some Roman generals recognized that these bonds were the real foundation of resistance. Remove the shrine, and you weakened the body. Destroy the symbol, and you cracked the spirit. They attacked not only people, but meaning itself. Generals ordered sacred relics to be paraded through streets as trophies, forcing locals to watch their gods carried like spoils of war. Priests were humiliated publicly, their rituals mocked or interrupted as soldiers laughed. Temples were stripped of their ornaments and repurposed into Roman administrative buildings, turning the heart of a culture into a stage for imperial authority. Entire communities found themselves confronting the loss of the things that made them who they were. A village that once gathered at the same stone circle for generations returned to find it shattered. A town whose ancestral tree symbolized unity watched as soldiers chopped it down and burned it in front of them. Families who held festivals for centuries saw their celebrations outlawed or replaced with Roman ceremonies they did not understand. These acts were not collateral damage, they were strategic, crafted to dissolve the emotional fibers that tied people together. This was the point where cruelty transcended the physical and became something far more invasive. The generals who orchestrated these events understood the psychological impact of forcing a conquered people to witness the destruction of their own past. They turned cultural erasure into a tactic of domination. Fear imposed obedience, but identity-breaking forged silence, deep, internal silence that allowed Rome to rule without constant force. What remained were populations who complied not because they accepted Roman authority, but because they no longer believed they had the strength to resist it. Even within the legions, these methods left a strange imprint. Soldiers who participated in such acts often described them as more unsettling than any battle. War had rules, fighting had purpose, but breaking the spirit of a community required a coldness that felt different. Some soldiers performed the tasks mechanically, suppressing discomfort because disobedience meant punishment. Others embraced the assignment, believing it proved their loyalty to their commander. Over time, these experiences shaped a generation of troops who carried both the weight and the numbness of what they had done. The effects rippled outward. Rumors spread to neighboring regions, amplifying the terror ahead of the army's arrival. Communities surrendered before seeing a single Roman soldier, convinced that resistance would lead to the erasure of everything they valued. Generals recorded these outcomes as strategic successes, proof that their methods worked. Rome praised them for pacifying territories efficiently, unaware or perhaps unwilling to acknowledge that these victories left cultural wounds so deep they would echo for centuries. And beneath it all, the I. Generals continued pushing the boundaries of what power allowed them to do. They believed that dominance was incomplete until it reached the mind, the memory, the things people passed on to their children. It is here, in this blend of cultural destruction and psychological conquest, that their displays of power became not only inhumane, but haunting in their ambition, shaping the very legacy of Rome in ways no battlefield could ever reveal. Before we continue, tell me in the comments how you think the destruction of identity compares to physical punishment, and which one leaves a deeper mark on a civilization. As these methods of psychological domination spread across the empire, something began happening within the ranks of the generals themselves. Power, especially when exercised through fear, had a way of transforming its wielder. Commanders who once followed Roman tradition gradually started believing they existed beyond it. Their reputations grew into legends, and the legends fed their sense of invincibility. A general feared by entire provinces no longer saw himself as accountable to the Senate, to military law, or even to Rome's cultural ideals. Instead, he became shaped by the very terror he created, evolving into a figure whose authority depended on constant escalation, and escalation always came with consequences. For many of these generals, the psychological destruction of conquered peoples was merely the beginning of their descent. The more their power grew, the more they relied on brutality to maintain it, and soon those same methods that subdued enemies began turning inward. Officers who questioned orders were punished with increasing severity. Centurions who expressed doubt were replaced or publicly humiliated to demonstrate the cost of disobedience. Even elite soldiers, usually shielded by prestige, could find themselves targeted if their loyalty wavered. The general's authority became a moving boundary, defined entirely by his moods, ambitions, and insecurities. Whispers traveled through the camps. Men who had served faithfully for years suddenly vanished. Patrols returned thinner than when they left. Punishments meant for deserters were applied to those who simply hesitated. An environment once structured around discipline shifted into unpredictable terror. Some legions became reflections of their commanders, tense, hardened, fearful, conditioned to act not out of duty, but out of survival. Others quietly fractured, loyalty eroding, under the constant strain of serving a man whose pursuit of dominance blurred the line between leadership and tyranny. Back in Rome, this spiral of power did not go unnoticed. Rivals monitored every rumor, every frightened report carried by traders or minor officers returning from distant frontiers. Ambitious politicians saw opportunity. A general who grew too dominant could be cast as a threat to Rome itself, a renegade whose cruelty endangered the empire's reputation. Others feared the opposite outcome, that such a general would return to Rome with an army molded by terror and absolute loyalty, capable of bending the political landscape to his will. In the Republic and early Empire alike, the balance of power was delicate, and a general who commanded more fear than the Senate commanded respect was a danger no one could fully predict. Yet, the most compelling consequence unfolded not in the Senate chambers, but in the minds of the generals themselves. As their authority expanded, so did the paranoia that came with it. Commanders who ruled through terror tend to expect rebellion everywhere, even within their trusted circles. They began interpreting silence as resistance, hesitation as betrayal. Minor disagreements turned into perceived conspiracies. Advisors who once guided them were dismissed or executed. The pursuit of total dominance fed a constant fear that someone, somewhere, sought to undermine it. This psychological unraveling carried ramifications across entire provinces. Decisions became harsher, punishments grew more elaborate, and the boundary between civilian populations and military targets blurred beyond recognition. Communities once terrorized for the sake of domination now suffered because of the generals' insecurities. Soldiers marched under leaders who no longer saw strategy but shadows, who interpreted obedience as temporary and loyalty as fragile. The cycle of brutality became self-sustaining. Cruelty bred fear, fear bred paranoia, and paranoia demanded more cruelty. And through all of this, Rome's territories trembled under an authority that felt less like imperial rule and more like the reign of a single man's unchecked impulses. These commanders, shaped by the fear they inflicted, drifted further from the ideals of Roman governance and deeper into a private realm of dominance and obsession. It was only a matter of time before the consequences of their unchecked power would collide with the shifting political and military currents of the empire, setting in motion events that no display of terror could prevent. As the influence of these generals grew, the ripple effect of their brutality extended far beyond the borders of the territories they controlled. Entire regions began to internalize a new image of Rome, an image defined not by its laws, architecture, or culture, but by the terror carried in the footsteps of its armies. Where Roman standards once represented order and structure, they now triggered silent dread. The empire's reputation transformed into something heavier, darker, shaped by the memories of those who had witnessed cruelty, not as an accident of war, but as a deliberate instrument of authority. Every new campaign carried the weight of what previous commanders had done, forming a legacy that could not be separated from Rome's ambitions. Communities that had never seen a Roman soldier in their lifetime whispered stories brought by merchants, refugees, and wandering survivors. Tales of destroyed shrines, broken traditions, and villages punished collectively traveled over mountains and across seas. Even exaggerated accounts served Rome's generals well, fueling the mythology surrounding their ruthlessness. Fear became a weapon that preceded them, softening resistance before their arrival. But as this reputation grew, it also created a world where the empire's presence was synonymous with the possibility of annihilation. Local leaders faced impossible choices: surrender entirely, negotiate from a position of weakness, or risk becoming the next example. Rome's dominance shifted from physical control to psychological presence, a shadow stretching across the ancient world. Within the empire, this evolving reputation carried a different significance. Roman citizens, many of whom never traveled beyond the Italian peninsula, absorbed reports of these feats with contradictory reactions. Some admired the iron grip that kept distant territories obedient. Others worried that such cruelty betrayed the ideals Rome claimed to uphold, yet even those who questioned the general's brutality often remained silent, aware that criticizing a victorious commander could be politically dangerous. Rome's identity fractured subtly, the celebrated bringer of civilization on one side and the feared destroyer of worlds on the other. But the ones who understood the implications most clearly were Rome's enemies. Kingdoms, tribes, and city-states along the frontiers adapted their strategies based on the generals' reputations. Some fortified themselves desperately, choosing death over humiliation. Others sought alliances, believing resistance was futile against leaders who wielded fear with surgical precision. There were even groups who used the empire's brutality as fuel for rebellion, uniting scattered factions under the promise of pushing back against a force that threatened not just their land, but their culture and identity. The terror of Rome inspired both submission and defiance, depending entirely on the resolve of those who faced it. For the empire itself, these tensions created an unexpected dilemma. The fear surrounding certain generals made rebellions less frequent but more intense when they did occur. Provinces struck back with a desperation forged by years of psychological pressure. Battles became bloodier, uprisings more organized, and alliances more determined. The harsh tactics that once secured quick victories now cultivated long-term hatred, eroding the stability Rome needed to maintain its vast territories. Even regions that remained quiet harbored resentments that simmered beneath the surface, waiting for the right moment or the right leader to ignite them. Inside the military, the consequences were equally profound. Legions shaped by cruel commanders carried their methods forward, passing them down to new recruits. What had once been the extreme behavior of a few became a shared culture among certain units. This normalization of brutality planted seeds within the Roman military structure that would echo for decades, shaping how future conflicts were fought. The identity of the empire itself began to shift, molded not by philosophy or tradition, but by the commands of men who used cruelty as a measure of strength. And so, as Rome expanded its reach, it also expanded the shadow cast by these generals. Their legacy intertwined with the empire's fate, influencing how the world saw Rome and how Rome saw itself. The power they wielded changed not only the conquered, but the conquerors, shaping the empire in ways no Senate decree could reverse, and setting the stage for the reckoning that would define the final part of this unfolding story. As the shadow of these generals stretched across the empire, the consequences of their actions began shaping not just Rome's present, but the way future generations would interpret its power. What had started as isolated acts of brutality slowly wove themselves into the broader narrative of Roman authority, becoming part of a legacy that no triumphal parade or marble monument could ever fully erase. The empire's most inhumane displays of power carved themselves into the collective memory of conquered peoples, transforming stories of resistance, suffering, and survival into quiet reminders of how fragile civilization can become when placed in the hands of men who rule through fear. Rome's political leaders struggled to control the narrative. Some attempted to distance the state from these generals, insisting that such cruelty was the work of individuals rather than the empire itself. Others embraced the fear these commanders generated, believing it kept distant territories compliant and reduced the need for constant military intervention. But the truth was more complicated. The actions of these generals had created ripples that Rome could no longer contain. Their cruelty had become inseparable from the imperial identity, shaping how allies, enemies, and even Rome's own citizens understood the nature of its dominance. Across the provinces, memories lingered in the ruins of sacred sites, in the stories whispered around hearths, in the places where families mourned what had been taken from them. Generals who believed they were forging order left behind landscapes filled with emotional scars. And those wounds did not disappear with time. They shaped the ambitions of future leaders, inspired rebellions long after the original acts had faded, and influenced how entire cultures remembered Roman rule. The psychological destruction inflicted by these commanders outlived their victories, creating a legacy that stretched beyond the lifespan of the empire itself. Within Rome, shifting power dynamics amplified these consequences. Commanders who returned from distant campaigns brought with them troops molded by terror, men whose loyalty was tied not to the state, but to the individual who had shaped their world through brutality. This created a new imbalance, one that threatened Rome's internal stability. The empire began to sense an uncomfortable truth. The terror that once expanded its borders now threatened its foundations. Generals who mastered the art of dominance became unpredictable forces, capable of influencing politics, manipulating public fear, and challenging the authority of even the most established institutions. And yet, despite the chaos these men caused, Rome could not entirely reject them. They were products of the very system that praised victory above all else, that rewarded efficiency regardless of cost, that celebrated conquest without fully reckoning with the human toll it demanded. Their brutality was not an anomaly. It was an extension of Rome's darker impulses, magnified through the hands of individuals who pushed those impulses far beyond what most Romans ever imagined. Their actions revealed a truth the empire struggled to face. Power, when left unchecked, often consumes the very structures meant to control it. The legacy of these generals stands as a reminder that the greatest threats to an empire often come not from outside its borders, but from the shadows it creates within itself. Their displays of inhumanity continue to shape how history remembers Rome, forcing us to look beyond the marble, the legions, and the triumphs, and confront the brutal reality hidden beneath. And as we move forward, reflecting on the rise and fall of civilizations, these stories reveal how easily the pursuit of power can twist into something far more destructive than any enemy the empire ever faced. If you stayed with me through this entire journey into the darkest corners of Roman power, leave a comment saying, "This message was for me, so I know you reached the end of this story." And if the depth of these events gave you a new perspective on how empires shape the world, make sure to like the video and subscribe so you don't miss the next exploration. There is another video here that expands on the hidden mechanics behind ancient dominance. So click and continue with me as we step deeper into the past.